Okay, so we are at 10 o'clock. Welcome, everybody. I see people are still streaming in, so thanks for joining wherever you are. We kind of have a nice time that can hit East Coast, West Coast, and maybe some happy hour join people in Europe. So welcome, everybody. My name is Bruce Gilley. I am the president of the Oregon Association of Scholars, which is the Oregon chapter of the National Association of Scholars. Very grateful to the National Association of Scholars headquarters staff, Chance Layton and Chris Kendall, for helping to set up this webinar. I am also a professor of political science at Portland State University, and I'm joined here today by Senator Dennis Linthicum, who is a senator in the Oregon Senate and a tireless advocate for academic freedom, free speech, constitutional liberties, and general quality of education issues in the state of Oregon and beyond. And I'm very grateful for his participation and his service in this cause. I'm also joined by my Portland State colleague, Dr. Peter Boghossian, who teaches in the Department of Philosophy at Portland State. And like me, takes an interest not just in matters on our home institution, but also the broader implications for what we notice in our own working lives for the implications for higher education and more broader kind of cultural and liberal questions about our current democracy. So we're today launching the revised version of our March report called The New Censorship in American Higher Education, Insights from Portland State University, as well as an update of the accompanying video. The links to the report and the video are in the chat, so Chance will highlight them as we go along, but you can find them there. It's also on the Oregon Association of Scholars YouTube channel, the video is, and the report is on the Oregon Association of Scholars website, oregonscholars.org. We have 60 minutes, and the plan is for each of us to give about a 10-minute brief overview, and then we'll have 30 minutes for Q&A. If you have questions, post them in the question section, the Q&A section. And then what's really useful is if there's a question that's there that is one you would like to see answered, then put a like by it, because that'll help to direct us to the questions that are of greatest interest to the audience. So make sure you make use of that kind of like function for questions that are already posted there. While the report we're issuing today focuses on Portland State University, and while Portland State University may be an extreme example of the threats to American higher education, it's certainly not unique. And we're really using this to open a conversation about higher education in general. We see very similar trends at the University of Texas, at MIT, at liberal arts colleges, obviously at Stanford, at Princeton. So this is not unique to Portland State. My own role here is, first of all, as the head of an advocacy organization, the Oregon Association of Scholars. Since Portland State is one of three major research universities in Oregon, it's obviously a focus of attention for the OAS. My second role is as a faculty member of Portland State itself. And I think one of the things that's become very clear in the course of the last few months is how important the role of academic freedom is for faculty members to critique governance at their own institutions, in particular when they observe problems that have become led from the top and where there's very little dissent being voiced. So I almost take my second role as a faculty member more seriously than my first as an advocate, because this is a central role for me as a faculty member to exercise my academic freedom with respect to my home institution. And I know that Dr. Boghossian feels likewise. Our report shines a light on what we believe is two damaging attacks on the core principles of the university taking place. And this has taken the form of two distinct but related strategies that have unfolded under President Stephen Percy since the fall of 2020. The first strategy is to curtail or ban criticisms of critical race theory, diversity training, woke studies programs, equity frameworks, or radicalized classroom teaching by redefining such criticism as harassment, or intimidation, or mob violence, or even, in the hyperbolic prose of our faculty senate presiding officer, hate crimes. This was begun, first of all, by our faculty union issuing a grievance against myself and Dr. Boghossian when we began to criticize some social justice teaching in the College of Education, and it was later institutionalized through a faculty senate resolution that the faculty senate has said should be the basis for administrative sanctions against faculty who criticize these woke studies or critical theorists. It will be further enhanced by the imposition of a mandatory 2-course sequence in race and ethnic studies at our university. Again, this is not unique to Portland State. But the point about that in terms of relation to censorship is presumably those classes will not be places of free discussion and debate where students are allowed to criticize race and ethnic studies and the foundations of those things if they intend to pass and graduate from college. The second strategy is an explicit denial of academic freedom, and hopefully, I think, ultimately a seeking of termination of employment for all faculty and for all faculty research that does not meet new anti-racism litmus tests being applied by the university. Again, this has been institutionalized, and I think a lot of what's the focus here is the institutionalization of this censorship as opposed to the soft censorship of the past. Our president has declared that anti-racism is his top priority as a university president. Our university diversity chief has said she intends to impose mandatory DEI litmus tests on new job hires and faculty performance and promotion processes. We now have an education task force that intends to create anti-racist scrutiny committees to scrutinize all teaching, research, and syllabi for anti-racist thought crimes. And finally, our faculty union has begun issuing fatwas, censorship statements, against faculty whose research they consider racist, yours truly being the first, but no doubt not the last target of this new institutionalization. So to summarize, we have two extraordinary things happening at Portland State. First of all, we have a rejection of academic freedom in the name of anti-harassment. And secondly, we have a rejection of academic freedom in the name of anti-racism. These two lines of attacks are seen in the Faculty Senate meeting, as well as subsequent statements that are shown in our video. The video is important for a couple of reasons. First of all, digital transparency helps to hold university officials accountable who would otherwise be sneaking these changes through without public notice. By dramatizing on a video, we help to bring transparency and at least debate about what's happening at the university. The second and unintentional reason this video became more important than I thought it would be is our university tried to censor it by using copyright law. And I'm very grateful to the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, as well as the Institute of Free Speech and Professor Eugene Volokh at the UCLA School of Law for refuting these claims. What's the implications of this? Obviously, this is a denial of the fundamental principles of a university with respect to the First Amendment and liberal equality. This is an institutionalization of censorship as opposed to the soft censorship that we've known about for 30 years. It's an institutionalization also of a particularly partisan social justice advocacy agenda into every aspect of the university operations. And as such, and I think probably Dr. Boghossian would share with me this view, this is a governance failure to be sure, and a legal and a policy issue to be sure. But I think what saddens us the most is this is an intellectual failure. This is a deep intellectual failure of a group of people who consider themselves intellectuals. Perhaps Portland State University, like other universities taking a similar path, should not call themselves universities anymore. The term university, of course, came from the Latin term that referred to the totality of scholars and the totality of knowledge and ideas on a particular subject. But Portland State is institutionalizing forms of censorship that quite intentionally and to make an extinction event of the totality of ideas and scholars on any given topic. What concerns me in the long term is that I think cancel culture will probably not be necessary in 10 years, since there won't be anything to cancel on campus. The university will have transformed into a cult, and the diversity of opinions and views that the public expects to find in a university will no longer be found on a university campus. As I say, this is happening at our university, but clearly there's implications and similar things happening elsewhere. So with that, I would like to turn to Senator Linthicum, if that's okay. I'm always wary of losing our senator to a sudden roll call meeting or something, and invite him to say some things to us. Can you unmute, Senator?
Yeah, the mute unmute is the bane of my life. All of our meetings are virtual now, and it's the hardest thing to remember because you feel like you're part of the conversation everybody's talking and whatever. And that brings an interesting point with regard to what you described, Professor Gilley. People are not robots. People are free will agents, and their free will is part of their component of action. It's their go-to point for either compliance or non-compliance within any sort of regulatory scheme at the academic level, at the government level. We are all paying attention to what the rules are, what's required of us, what would be polite, what would be appropriate, what's inappropriate. And we're weighing those things all the time. Self-censorship is a problem in this arena, as well as what you're seeing, I think, at PSU in particular is really a fundamental violation of the idea that all men, it's a self-evident truth, all men and women, all people are created equal. They all carry their own conscience, they carry their own intellect, they carry their own passions, their own desires, their own likes, their own dislikes, their own opinions. They're as unique of individuals as we are with our fingerprints. And I think that fundamental issue is the single most important moral component that we should be describing, because you and I and Dr. Boghossian should all be free to express our thoughts, diverge from each other, coalesce on specific issues, and even argue. You're wrong, you're right, your point is misstated. Are you sure you don't want to rework that? Can't you be a little kinder? How about a little bit of gentleness here? What about some grace? I want the facts, I want the truth, I want it. And all of these talking points are fundamental to who we are as people. This is what makes humankind so beautiful, so unique. And believe me, at the state legislature, the worst thing that we see on a daily basis is freedom. Freedom is a messy business. Everybody has their own little venture, their own rabbit trail, their own desire, their own perspective on issues. And to think that what we're seeing in both of those institutions, in the government institution and in the intellectual academic institutions, is we're seeing a top-down totalitarian view of what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. This totalitarian perspective, this coercion to comply, is what we've seen throughout history in totalitarian regimes. And at the core is this stubborn fact that people are unique and they're free will agents, and they should have the dignity and freedom to act as they choose. And we've limited that certainly with our civil code and our criminal code. You're as free as you want to be. However, you don't have the freedom to break the window of the jewelry store and clean out all of the diamonds that are on display. And we do that because we believe in these things. Your life belongs to you, your liberty belongs to you, your personal pursuits, your entrepreneurship, your endeavors, your ability to create carvings out of trees from the forest, whatever that is, and have those little totem poles for sale in your window. Nobody has the right to steal that value from you. It's the value of your mind, your gifts, your talents, your ability to create something that's for sale. And we see these things every time you go to the beach. You'll see some cool gadget made out of myrtle wood, and you'll go, I want that on my display shelf. Well, if we didn't value the work of the individual and their passion for carving that and securing their dignity in their work, in their life, and their entrepreneurship, and the rewards of their gifts and talents, we would just say, take it off the store shelf. Fine, it's yours. You can do as you please. So we have more than enough sideboards that exist currently in law without violating an individual's conscience, without violating an individual's perspective, their likes, their dislikes, their preferences, and their worldview. And so I think this is a real important discussion, because if you miss that at the very beginning, if you miss that, you've missed the whole game.
Thank you, Senator. I'm again grateful for your advocacy and your voice of conscience in our legislature, which, as you say, has very strong parallels to our universities here, because we are a blue state, or a one-party state, essentially. And so you're dealing with a very similar dynamic, and I appreciate you, because I know you live it every day in our state capital. I will now turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Boghossian.
Thank you. Let's be blunt about what we face. We face a group of small-minded, petty ideologues who have hijacked a public institution, who are hell-bent on ripping down Western civilization. This is explicit in the doctrines of critical race theory. They have created a system and a structure in which any form of dissent is punished as the new heretic. You are a heretic and you have committed blasphemy against the ideology. This is an ideology that proselytizes the consciousness of otherwise ordinarily people who are ordinarily reasonable. What this is not is a partisan issue. And anyone who attempts to make it a partisan issue is missing the point. This is a question of cognitive liberty. This is a question of people attending public institutions, our students being able to think for themselves and have their beliefs questioned and challenged, and being able to question and challenge the beliefs of their professors and fellow students in a way that's respectful and in good faith. And we do not have that. We have a catastrophic failure of the system right now. So I think it's important to drill down on a few of these themes as they relate to the current cultural moment. The first is that my colleagues at PSU have systematically culled out any conservative voices. They've systematically culled out the voices of classical liberals. They're now putting equity mandates into the curricula for faculty, as one of my colleagues said to me. This isn't me, this is the faculty senate. They've decided that. He's actually correct. So what is the situation in which we find ourselves? We find ourselves, and I want to go back to Bruce's word because I think it's so important. This has been institutionalized. These ideas, this conformity of thought, this viewing, it's not even a viewing, it's the characterization of criticism as harassment or you're a racist. The president of Portland State University has said, and the video that Chase posted here, the top priority of Portland State is to be an anti-racist, sorry, I'm looking at the comments, it's to be an anti-racist institution. I think we have to have a public discussion about that. If Portland State University is racist, and I constantly receive emails that it is racist, here's what I would like to know. I would like to know exactly what the mechanism of racism is, and I would like to know exactly how we would fix it. Where is the racism at Portland State University? I would also like to, every single person who's been complicit in the racism, I would like them to be, I would like an atmosphere of full transparency and accountability for the racists. Beyond this, however, I would like to say that in spite of a university that constantly, incessantly talks about race and gender and sexual orientation and almost never mentions knowledge or scholarship or academic excellence or any of the intellectual virtues currently associated with university systems, I have yet to see one single faculty member or member of the administration resign from Portland State University who is white to make their position available for a person of color. So I'm forced to conclude they have no skin in the game, and these people are exhibiting verbal behavior and they're hypocrites. So if you genuinely want to make space for people of color at Portland State University, Dr. Percy, resign. Susan Jeffords, resign. Alex Sager from the philosophy department, resign. None of these people are resigning. They're not resigning either because they don't believe it and it's verbal behavior, or it's a kind of signaling to others about their virtue. I want to mention as well the danger to the democracy when you have a group of people who have hijacked an institution, who are absolutely convinced, completely as a metaphysical certitude, that they know what the truth is, and then they will not broker dissent. As Lukianoff and Haidt say in The Coddling of the American Mind, one of the consequences of this is that people become more fragile. They become less capable of engaging ideas. They become less capable of engaging other people as people who engage those ideas. And so we have a situation in which people like Dr. Gilley and myself who disagree with the orthodoxy, it's not merely that we're wrong, it's that we're bad people. And remember, this is not a scientific, they're not promulgating anything scientific. These ideas are not falsifiable. They have not used rigorous methods to come to these conclusions. So this is an extraordinarily serious problem. What we can do about it will take another day, but the first step in solving any problem is to be honest about it. And the honesty is there are a group of ideologues who broker no dissent, who characterize criticism of their ideas as harassment, who are very quick to weaponize mechanisms of the university against dissenters, as they have done to Bruce, as they have done to me repeatedly. We cannot tolerate this. And I advocate for the complete defunding of Portland State University or any other university that railroads a dangerous anti-American ideology that attempts to rob people of their cognitive liberty. It's a disgrace, and people must be held accountable for it. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Boghossian. Forthright as usual, and I really appreciate that. There's some great questions coming up on the chat. I just wanted to pick up on one thing. Maybe I'd ask both you and Senator Linthicum to address themselves to briefly. Is you mentioned students, right? What is in the interest of students? What if ultimately we're concerned about higher education because we're there to serve students and prepare students for life in the pluralistic and diverse and rambunctious American society, what is in the interest of students? Because much of this that has been passed, what we call the new censorship, so the imposition of critical race theory and woke studies and diversity mandates and anti-racist scrutiny, as well as the attempts to censor and condemn people whose research doesn't meet these new standards, namely you and me, but there will be others, is done with the claim that this is what the students need, right? That this protects the students, this creates a safe space for the students. This allows students from marginalized backgrounds to feel more valuable, for their self-esteem to be raised up. And so we're both talking in the same language of what do students need. So what's the reply to the idea that, we must be anti-student? If you don't agree with this, you must be anti-student.
Okay, I have three responses to that. Students need, the goal of the institution should be to educate students. Students need to be in an environment where they can question and challenge and be questioned and challenged. And the North Star of that institution, of every academic institution, is the same from Plato's Republic of taking people out of the cave. I did a reverse Q&A at Portland State University, and I think I did it on March 7th. I remember the date because that was the last day I left the house before the pandemic, in which I encouraged anybody and everybody. I sat in the audience and students could come up and did come up and talked about their experiences with social justice in the classroom. And I would urge everyone to watch the reverse Q&A to listen to students in their own words what they want to do. And it's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying how professors look at the university, my colleagues look at the university as an ideology mill, as an indoctrination camp. So what do students need? They need to be challenged and questioned in good faith. They need professors who are published in their area of expertise. They need a rigorous environment in which academic excellence and meritocracy takes the lead. And here's the other thing that I think that we should be having a public discussion about. Oh, and they also need to be taught how to speak to people across political and moral and religious gulfs. Here's the other thing that I think we have to have a conversation about. When the president of the University of Portland State says that the primary mission of Portland State is to end racism, is there something that he can be wrong about? Can the president of the university be wrong about what the primary mission of the university is? If the president of Portland State University said, well, you know, the primary mission of the university is to Paul Ocado that comes in to the supermarket at Safeway and Fred Meyer's for the next 5 years, is there something for him to be wrong about? And how do we figure out what the thing is for him to be wrong about? Because there's one thing for sure, there's been no public discussion about that. And I'd like to see public discussions and vibrant debates come back to Portland State and other institutions as incubation places for American democracy, where people are actually talking about engaging ideas instead of exactly the opposite.
Okay, good. Yes, well, that's precisely why the tradition until recently has been that university presidents set the mission as the provision of excellence in education and research. Senator, on this question of students?
Yeah, well, this is really wide-ranging. The reason we believe in this idea of liberal education is not because we want them to know the facts. When was the Civil War, or when was the Spartan, conflict, or when did Moscow fall, or what? We're not interested in those issues. What we're really interested in is part of what makes us human again. It's the real depth of the human soul. And this is why what Martin Luther King Jr. said as he wrote in the Birmingham jail is so important. He says, I want my 4 children. He's talking in traditional values, he and his wife and his 4 children. I want my 4 children to grow up in a world where they won't be known by the color of their skin, but the content of their character, where every individual in the community isn't known by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. This is also a part of the university's endeavor. So look at what this looks like if we start talking about character. You've got honor, or let's look at all the positive kinds of character traits: honor, integrity, truthfulness. How about politeness, courtesy, gratitude, justice, gentleness, openness, fairness, respectfulness, tolerance, mercy, kindness, endurance, creative ingenuity, hard work, peacefulness, frugality, faithfulness, forbearance, humility. If I were with a group of people, students, adults, men and women of 1,000 different nations, if they all exhibited those traits, I would be in love with all of my brothers and sisters on planet Earth. This is the utopian mind. And yet there is an opposite to all of these things: dishonor, corruption, untruthfulness, impoliteness, discourtesy, ingratitude, injustice, rudeness, closed-mindedness, unfairness, disrespectfulness, intolerance, impurity, malevolence, unkindness, lethargy, laziness, violence, wastefulness, unfaithfulness, impatience, vulgarity, arrogance. The lists go on. And what this proves is we care more about these values than the color of one's skin. Because if we focus on the color of one's skin and we do not focus on the heart and soul of an individual's character, again, we miss the boat entirely, because we're now intent on hiring a new professor or hiring an individual within the government sector, who meets the skin requirement of having a better tan than you or I. But if their character traits if they're discourteous and closed-mindedness and malevolent and intolerant, we did a poor job in our hiring cycle. So how we've taken meritocracy or character content off the table and fallen prey to this evolutionary mindset that one race might be better than another race, or one race is more oppressive than another race, and that entire environment, we really, again, we have shot the wrong enemy here. The enemy is bad character, bad principles, bad moral value, bad understanding of traditional, in the education arena, the traditional liberal education is to expose these things, expose the corruption in the past, identify it so that we don't engage in that same corruption today in the present. If corruption isn't even on the table as a topic of discussion, only skin color is on the table, or only ethnic background or country of origin is on the table, then somebody from a more corrupt country could certainly bring their corrupt baggage with them and be part of the American enterprise. And all of us would say, I guess that didn't work out well. And so this is really an important topic for educating students in the next generation. We need to kind of reorient them towards this colorblind society so that they value these content of character and meritocracy issues that we're describing in this conversation.
Okay, thank you. And that's I really appreciate your testimony, just reminding us of the dignity of the individual and the diversity of the individual. In the discussions that have been taking place at Portland State, people have started to refer to the university as a collective, which is, for those of us who study communist politics, that's frightening, and it just suggests that there's a loss of the sensibility of the individual and the diversity of the individual, and that has got to be at the center, certainly, of a university. Maybe not of your church or your soccer team, but certainly at a university, that's got to be central. I'm going to do a couple of kind of omnibus questions, because one of the things I'm noticing in the Q&A is the obvious questions are, what can we do, right? What can be done? I see a question about what can students do? Do students as paying customers have an ability to push back on this? Someone says, I teach at a university, and the university is institutionalizing a very similar kind of anti-racist commitments. How can we push back on this at the department level? If you're an employee of a public institution as a faculty member, what are your modes of appeal against this? And Danielle in the UK says, can the market help us solve this problem? That students would kind of vote with their feet and move towards institutions that maintain a more free environment. It makes me think about a friend of mine at UT Austin, and I said, don't you think the state legislature will do something about the new anti-racist revolution at UT Austin? He said, no, they're all too busy trying to get their kids into the university to do that. So, and I think that raises a question. So in our report, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Boghossian and the senator again. We suggest that the internal mechanisms of correction are no longer likely to work. And I honestly think what has been the most discouraging to me about what I've seen at my home institution is not the tiny band of radicals who have seized the ship of state and are trying to drive it onto the rocks, because every university has its tiny band of radicals in these departments: film studies, gender studies, anthropology, social work, right? So that's not surprising. What's been surprising and discouraging for me is to see that the vast majority of the faculty, many of whom are not in social science and humanities, have simply not stood up or done anything to act those internal correction mechanisms. Because because it shouldn't be hard, actually, right? What's happening at my university does not represent the considered views of our university faculty, I believe, if we were to actually bring everyone into a room. But the inability or unwillingness to deal with these problems internally, I think, by necessity creates a need for external mechanisms of accountability and correction. So what are those external mechanisms? Yes, perhaps the market has a role to play. I do think that, evergreen implosion is always a possibility for a university that really gets captured by this radical agenda. Will Portland State become evergreen? Will it implode? I don't think so, if only because it still is a pretty good deal compared to most colleges. And so the market may work, but I think that, frankly, parents and students are too busy trying to get into college, get their degree, and get onto the job force. This needs to be done by those who have a special charge for higher education. So I do think that state legislatures are very important here. And I think what we've seen in Idaho and now in South Dakota suggests that it's possible for state legislatures to take action to correct the radical, revolutionary, illiberal trends on campus and reassert the importance of freedom and liberal equality in these institutions. And so I think the legislatures are important. I do think, regretfully, that legal mechanisms are always important. I mean, I don't think our video would be public if we had not had an 8-page legal brief done for us by the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. So alas, we do have to fall back on legal arguments. And I think that's an important corrective. And then the third thing I'd say is, boards of trustees were supposed to be the external kind of ombudsman actors here. And I think there's just a lot of work to be done to reform boards of trustees. I mean, they've become basically sinecures, where the board members don't exercise their functions. And I think it's kind of like, I think of the great global financial crisis, and what were those boards doing? Were they not monitoring their jobs? And how that created a real emphasis on making boards that actually scrutinize their institutions. And I think university boards of trustees, beginning with the Portland State University Board of Trustees, really need to be reformed so that they exercise their scrutiny functions, because they're uniquely positioned to do that. Pete, I'll turn it to you next.
Thanks, Bruce. I'm still thinking about the senator's last answer and your last answer as well. So here's what I think needs to be done. The first thing you need to do is show up. So you need to show up to meetings. People simply don't show up to meetings, and consequently, many of these ideas are railroaded through. If you want to watch Benjamin Boyce's videos of what's happened in Washington State with the Equity Commission, it's fascinating. And so maybe Chance can post some of these. Second is you need to have a basic education of what these terms mean: equity, diversity, inclusion being the three, decolonization, which Bruce and I will talk about. We need a basic understanding of the terms because people have been hoodwinked by those. You can educate yourself. The best resource I recommend to educate yourself is Cynical Theories by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay. One of the mechanisms that we see by which people have been hoodwinked is not only that they changed the meanings of everyday words like racism, but they also perpetuate the lie that they're continuing the civil rights movement. They're not continuing the civil rights movement. Everything that the senator said about Martin Luther King and making judgments about people and the content of their character, this is antithetical to the fundamental precepts of critical race theory. And so we need to educate ourselves. The next thing is, if you're an alumni, stop donating to Portland State University until this madness is over. If you know people who are major donors to universities, contact them and tell them what's going on. All you need to do is be honest. This is what's happening at the university. And ideologues despise honesty. They're like cockroaches. They can't stand the light of day and truth that emerges. The next thing, and Chance, if you could post this as well, if you could post the video of Jody Shaw saying, "I have a few requests," and it's available on YouTube. And basically she looks into the camera and she says, Smith College, I have a few requests. And she talks about her experiences as an administrator in an incredibly heartfelt way. Those testimonies change the moral mind. They do, because a lot of people just simply don't know what's going on and they can't understand it. So your testimonies to these things will help. The next thing you can do is document. Document everything you can. Video documentary is the best. I've been told I'm not allowed to make any videos on campus at Portland State University anymore. So get on tape. And if you look at Paul Rossi, what he has done, he's a portrait in courage. He's a high school math teacher at an elite university in which he recorded the conversations, find out what the law is. But you have to make public the documentation. And there are organizations like the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism and other organizations that are coming up. One thing that I've been hesitant to advocate, but I now advocate, is full-scale lawfare. Lawfare being law and war. So sue people. We have to sue to stop this ideology. There's also something like the Southern Poverty Law Center does, like naming and shaming, but basically join a group, find someone like the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, and I can put links to that later on, or Chance can put links to that. Find groups and contribute. Contributions don't have to be financial. If you're an artist, contribute there. If you do videography or film editing, contribute there. All of us need to fight back against this illiberalism. And so there are some stages, but the most important thing by far is to show up. Now, if the final thing is the ancient Greek virtue of parrhesia, speak truth in the face of danger. Many people, when they go through the tenure process, become cowards. They become too afraid to speak. They become cowed because they want to get tenure and promoted and get jobs for life. The consequence of that is that it makes them cowards. It makes them weak. So don't be weak. Don't let, first they came for, then they came for. We are now at a critical stage where you have to speak truth to the face of danger, in the face of danger. If you do not, they will continue to railroad this ideology down everybody's throat.
Thanks, Pete. You are, as usual, more the ideas person. I appreciate that. Reformulate the concepts, speak up, show up. Don't lose the argument. I think that's always essential. Senator, what do you think can be done here?
Yeah, I think Peter did a great job of giving us kind of the action items. And certainly as a minority in the legislature, I don't have a lot of pull with regard to how these issues come up. If you were to watch the legislative testimony, you will hear white supremacy and oppression, and you will hear statistics that have nothing to do with the bill or legislative concept that's in front of us, and certainly don't identify racism as such to be the sole answer for the issue that we see with regard to the disparity in some statistical value. And what we don't account for is all of the literally hundreds of variables that go into somebody succeeding or not succeeding when it comes to any issue in the public sphere. And if we continue to make the mistake of thinking we can solve it by enforcing in the same way PSU wants to enforce the critical race theory, if that's where we go to, that's our go-to weapon to demand submission and demand compliance and coerce people into obedience, what we'll get a lot of self-censorship. And self-censorship, potentially leads to just fake compliance. And by doing that, we're really putting people into a funny spot because they start to lose their independence and they become dependent at that point. Now, all of a sudden, you're looking to the expert to tell you how to walk down the street, what to choose, what not to choose. And that defeats the human dignity concept that we've been talking about all along. Once the state starts to coerce a person's submission, they really have defeated that individual's common sense. And now that common sense is out the window, it breeds more and more dependence. And so it is one of those things that's very difficult. But I think Peter's quick little hit list is a great place to start.
Thank you. I realize with students themselves, in terms of, students can, of course, change to a different major. That's what a lot of people do. They vote with their feet, and of course, vote with their feet. And that's one of the reasons we see these kind of essentially kind of bailout programs for woke studies departments, is because students quickly abandon them. And so that's why they're trying to impose mandatory woke studies requirements to graduate. Students can leave, they can change majors. There have been actually quite a lot of recent legal precedents where students have sued their universities after the university tried to coerce them or punish them or somehow hold them back for speaking out in class, for being critical of an enforced ideology, and they've won, right? Not surprisingly. I mean, this is a no-brainer at the level of First Amendment jurisprudence. But students, they need to be willing to go through that process. I don't think we can expect every student to, lawyer up, when they're just trying to get their degree and get onto the job market. I do think there's something in the idea of the sort of the what Pete says, kind of speaking out to evil, that even if it's a noble failure, which it may well be if you are outnumbered, whether outnumbered in a legislature, outnumbered in a faculty senate meeting. I note that in our neighbor to the north in Washington state, the state legislature just passed mandatory diversity training as a state level law for all public university faculty and staff. Every 2 years, they're all trooped off for mandatory diversity training, which will begin next year. This is a remarkable kind of institutionalization and totalitarianization of the diversity, inclusion, and equity agenda. But one of the things I found interesting there is in the debate in the Washington legislature, 3 amendments were raised and defeated, but raised, of course, by Republicans. One of them said, this diversity training needs to be voluntary, which would, of course, defeat the purpose. So that was defeated. But I think just kind of forcing the majority to say, yeah, this is mandatory indoctrination is useful. The second amendment said, during this training, no group shall be disparaged or treated as inferior or talked down to. So there's no disparagement or racism against any group allowed. That amendment was defeated. So again, to me, that's an important moral victory, is to force the majority to say, no, we're okay with racism as long as it's directed at certain groups. And the third amendment that was raised and failed was the requirement that during these trainings, all participants would be allowed free speech and the free debate of ideas. That amendment was also defeated, right? So I think sometimes forcing the majority to come clean about what it's doing by saying this is enforced indoctrination, this sanctions hatred against some groups, and this is a denial of free speech, I think that can be very powerful. And I think what Washington is going to show us, kind of as the senator said too, is when you mandate thought, right, as in any totalitarian system, you're always going to stub your toe on the stubborn fact of the individual, right? This is the lesson of communist systems. This is the lesson of history. The dignity and the stubbornness of the individual is always going to win out. The question is for us, maybe Dr. Boghossian and I, as we get into the twilights of our careers, is what are we leaving behind, right? I mean, were it not for the fluke that we happen to be at PSU, right? This would have been just passing like a train in the night, right? Nobody would have noticed this. Nothing would have been said. So what's the legacy we're leaving behind? And I know that the senator in his contribution to our video raised the same question more generally about our democracy. What's the legacy of intolerance that gets left in the train of these sorts of initiatives when social justice or racial justice advocacy is allowed to defeat individual free speech and individual consciousness. And I think that's kind of the issue that I'm hearing from both of you.
I'd like to take that question up and then piggyback off of what you said. The legacy that we are leaving a generation of students is that they've become more brittle to ideas that they don't like. They're more quickly to be offended. They're less capable of talking to people who have different ideas. We've entrenched polarization in our country. It's more difficult to solve problems because we can't be honest about them. The legacy we've left is a legacy of almost enfeebling or crippling our economic competitiveness with the rest of the world. Certainly, if you wanted to develop a tool, in fact, I was just in LA recently, and Faisal Al-Mutar, who runs Ideas Beyond Borders, told me that entire Russian, Chinese, and some Middle Eastern countries as well, propaganda machines have entire networks in English devoted to BLM to separate and divide us. So the legacy that we are leaving is one in which the people participating in the economic and cultural system are so fragile that they can't fully participate in civil life. They're looking for grievances everywhere. They're looking for racism everywhere. They're looking for sexism and homophobia everywhere. And the tragedy of this is that there is racism, there is sexism, there is bigotry, and there is homophobia. But the solutions that they have offered are not solutions. They're not even ersatz solutions. They're not even fake solutions. They're leading us away from what we can do to remediate genuine injustices. And part of the reason is because we have people who are so certain that what they believe is true, that there is no questioning that idea. So I want to get back to something Bruce said as well. One thing that we have to be willing to do is we have to be willing to step across the aisle. So if you're listening to this and you're a Democrat and you find Ted Cruz repugnant, you have to be willing to step across the aisle if somebody has an idea that, if somebody holds a vision for the United States, which is rooted in evidence and historical precedent, and that vision comports with the well-being of people in the country. You also have to be able to step aside from the rank partisanship and tribalism in your own political and ideological community. And don't be afraid to question or challenge those people who are spreading dangerous ideas. So if you're on the left, a good idea for that would be to attempt to speak truth in the face of danger. There's the virtue again, parrhesia, and criticize your own community. Because it's more important that you say true things and you act in a way that's accordance with the truth than that you have a lot of friends and that you're chummy. That's one thing that we have that they don't have.
If I can piggyback in that arena, if we look at our own history here in the United States, for example, if those major institutions that are purporting to have the superior morality or the superior intellect or the better science, if those institutions had been alive and could have quelched the story about Rosa Parks in the back of the bus or the front of the bus, if that would have happened let's move it back to the 1850s, if the slavery, the law of the land in all of the South were never allowed a moral challenge, we would never have the construct of rise up and walk with our feet, vote with our conscience, vote with our moral values, our preferences, our likes, our dislikes, our understanding. None of that would be allowed because it would have been crushed at the technological center of the day. And if you think, somehow that would still work out correctly and slavery would be abolished because it's so horrid an institution, I think you're mistaken, because the political momentum of the South, and by the way, all the Jim Crow laws that impacted the South in very negative ways, that all arose from what we call the American system. And that's why it rightly does carry some, some responsibility. I'm not denying that the responsibility doesn't belong there. I'm not denying that there were things done that were immoral, inappropriate, that those things were horrid. However, the key to solving that is allowing the moral voice and conscience of individuals to rise up and challenge the status quo. Without being able to challenge the status quo at the university or at the legislature, we are necessarily constraining and hog-tying every person that follows in our footsteps. And certainly we all ought to be, if they're going to claim moral superiority or superior intellect or better science, we should certainly be willing to discuss the facts and the hows and the whys and the whatnots. And that's currently not allowed.
Yeah, and I think this makes me think of, I mean, some of the comments and questions have said, you're focused on higher education or the legislature, but this is now in every institution of society. This is in the business sector. This is in the news media. This is in the arts world. The sort of walking on eggshells and not being able to contribute positively to your organization because you're afraid of being accused of being a racist or offending somebody. And what that does, of course, is it reduces organizational effectiveness for problem solving and for achieving a mission. It's got to be a great irony that Dr. Boghossian and I were both in subsequent weeks participants in a great seminar down at the Claremont colleges on blacklisted professors. And it's got to be one of the great ironies that we can only engage in education and free speech with students who are not our own. And therefore, the students at Claremont had the benefits of my pedagogy for an hour in a way that I could never offer to my own students. And I was asked to talk about my work on colonialism. And of course, many of the students said they were offended and whatnot. But anyways, we had a vibrant discussion, a discussion I would never dare to have with my own students, even though they actually pay my salary, precisely because, as the memorable phrase used by the senator, I'm hogtied, right? Our individuality is hogtied. And when individuality is hogtied in an organization, the effectiveness, the ability to solve real problems, and there are real problems, is vastly reduced. And it's got to be a great irony that our academic freedom, right, is protected least in our home institution, and most in places where we can be relatively immune to, diversity investigations, ethical review boards, student complaint processes, things like that. Pete?
Thanks, Bruce. I appreciate that. And Phil Zuckerman approached Bruce and I, and I also felt when I give a guest lecture that I'm free to speak in a way that I cannot speak at Portland State University. Julie Carrion of the Office of Diversity and Equity Inclusion has told me, and this, Senator, may mind blow you because it certainly mind blew me. And in that meeting where I'm a member of the Portland State University Union, Phil Lesh, and the philosophy department chair, Alex Sager, that is the only one of the things in my Title IX investigation that I asked questions about, and there was subsequent deep conversation because I simply couldn't believe what she told me. And she told me that I'm not allowed to render my opinion about a protected class or teach in any way such that my opinion about a protected class should be known. And so, of course, the first thought that comes to your mind is, well, what do you do if someone says to you, what is your opinion about Black people being enslaved? Well, you can't give your opinion about that because it's against Julie Carrion has, I mean, it's a horrific situation that we have to go off campus or to podcast to have honest conversations about topics that are morally difficult. But what's even more interesting about that is that there are entire wings of university architecture dedicated to talking about race and class and sexual orientation. There are entire departments whose raison d'etre it is to talk about and create student activists. But I can't can't render my opinion or even teach in such a way that my opinion is rendered. So this is not an education people are receiving. This is an indoctrination. They're not allowed to hear heterodox views or ideas. And we have to be very, very thoughtful about how to proceed from here. What does one do when the whole institution has been hijacked? It's a very, very serious question that, again, I just want to leave people with this. This is not a partisan issue. This has nothing to do with conservatives or liberals or Democrats or Republicans. These are unscientific, unfalsifiable ideas. These are morally fashionable notions that are being promulgated by groups of ideologues. Now, I don't know if I agree with Bruce or not in terms of the percentage of people who actually adhere to this, because we don't know, because they won't come out and speak. But I do think that the Overton window has shifted such that these ideas, which were unthinkable a short time ago, that we judge people on the basis of their racial characteristics. I mean, we have a word for that. And there's the reason that we call these people racist, because that's what it is. But there's a new type of racism. It's a neo-racism, in which one's speech acts, the things one say, are directly, whether or not you can find truth or have access to truth, has to deal with your immutable characteristics. This is grotesque. This is un-American. And we have groups of people who are pushing this idea, and it has to be stopped. And I don't know at this point if it can be stopped at Portland State. I don't know. I'm not optimistic about the future.
Okay, thank you. We are at 11, and I am always a stickler for timing. I want to really thank, first of all, the National Association of Scholars for hosting this. I believe the recording will be available on the NES YouTube channel. Our report is available at oregonscholars.org, in the video on the Oregon Scholars YouTube channel. I especially want to thank Senator Linthicum for taking time out of his busy schedule down in Salem, fighting the good fight, for joining us, and of course, my great colleague, Dr. Peter Boghossian. Thank you to all our participants for joining, and have a great rest of your week.